Hello, encouragers. I'm Rebekah Scott, wife, mother of 4, author, and owner and designer of Rebekah Scott Designs. I'm here to encourage you, to make you feel that I can do this spirit each and every day of our awesome journeys to fulfill our many important roles. I believe we are fully equipped to execute, and I will provide as much knowledge, practices, and systems as I can to help you understand just what I know you can do. Execute. We got this. Hello, encouragers. Thanks for tuning in today. I've got a super exciting podcast, something that I have been talking about on the podcast for probably the last 2 years, but more or less winging it with some blog entries that I've read and anything I can hear from my brother who's getting more fluent with it with his children with ADHD. But we're going to talk about diets for children today. And not just it's kind of like an unsexy term when you say diets with children and people may roll over, but it is so important, and I'm really hoping that at the end of this podcast, you will understand the importance of what you're putting into your child's body and how much better you will smile and laugh and have smoother days when you do really dial this in. The importance for me, especially because I work from home with my tiny coworkers, controlling their diet, and maybe control is not the right word, but being concerned with what's going into their body makes a huge difference on how our day goes. So I have invited Dr. Melanie Mullenmeister to inform us on everything she does with this every single day. So Melanie, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you got into this subject.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me on the show. I'm super excited to talk about this because I just think it's such an important issue that as a mom of 3 myself, absolutely needs to be addressed because I see the effects of this in my own kids, in addition to just all the children that come into my clinic. But I'm a chiropractor in Mitchell, South Dakota. My clinic is a chiropractic center for healthy living, and I really have a focus on nutrition because I am a firm believer that, you know, we are what we eat, basically, which sounds cliche, but we provide so much of the fuel supply for our body and how we function and how we interact and how we engage in life, really, through the food choices. I mean, that's the first and foremost choice for whether you're eating something that promotes disease or whether you're eating something that promotes health. And we often, as moms, are thinking about it for ourselves, but we tend to just not pay as much attention with our kids for whatever reason, because they're picky eaters or they're whiny that day and you just want to make them happy, or you're tired and you don't want to have to think about what they're eating. But I've really come to realize the huge importance of identifying foods that are going to really help my child reach their greatest potential in life, or foods that are going to really possibly create some concerning issues, whether that's behavior, whether that's ability to focus in school, learning, all sorts of stuff. So cool stuff we're going to talk about today. I'm excited.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for laying that all out. And I met Dr. Melanie through Erin, who helps us with our Facebook page. So thank you, Erin, because we were chatting about it among ourselves. And I said, well, who's an expert in this? Because I'm just doing the bare minimum. And so she mentioned you. So thank you for coming on. I'm excited. Can you tell us some of the rises in childhood obesity, or what you would have to say about this broad topic?
Yeah, interestingly enough, the New York Times just last week posted a report from JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, with the latest obesity trends. And as a country, we continue to get fatter, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is just lack of knowledge of what food does to our system. But the concerning thing to me was the age group that showed the greatest increase in obesity from the last time these statistics were run in 2011 was the age group of 2 to 5 years of age. Oh. And I just thought, wow, because that's where so much brain development is occurring, muscle development is occurring, coordination, learning, all of that is supposed to be exploding from ages 2 to 5. But if we have childhood obesity exploding as well, then that's an inflamed brain. That's an inflamed muscle system. It's going to affect their whole body, not just their little tummies. And so that's concerning to me. And that's where I've really been talking with my patients about their kids and their overall health, but also helping them just identify simple things that they can be doing. That's going to make a big difference for how this child grows up.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty scary, especially the 2 to 5, because that's when
Isn't that crazy?
Nice little healthy bubble, and it's being undone. Yes.
Right. Exactly.
So talk to us a little bit about behavioral concerns, meaning even if your child hasn't been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, which none of mine have as of yet, but I still follow what my brother would suggest for both of his children have been diagnosed with both of these. And so his counselor recommended limiting red dye and a lot of different food choices. Can you talk to us a little bit across the board what we should be doing for our children if they've been diagnosed with it, but even if they haven't, what does the food choices impact on our child's brain considering their behavior?
Oh, absolutely. The behavior correlates with body composition, too. I mean, reasons that we have childhood obesity are the same reasons we have escalating diagnoses of hyperactivity. You know, like it all can be oftentimes traced back to food choices. But red dye number 40 is just a really tough preservative dye toxin, for lack of a better word, to the brain. And what's crazy is that 43% of child-oriented products contain red dye number 40.
43%? Holy cow.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, I mean, and so kids want to eat food like this because it's bright and happy and cheerful and looks like it's going to melt in my mouth, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at the actual data behind what red dye number 40 is doing to children's brains, it has been linked study after study with all sorts of psychiatric issues. Like that child who's just perfectly happy and then all of a sudden is not, like just raging or throwing a fit or, I mean, and kids do that, right? But when you're consistently seeing just explosive behavior, aggressive behavior, erratic behavior, possible hyperactivity, a lot of that in a vulnerable brain can be traced back to red dye number 40. And so, but what people don't realize, people will say this to me all the time, oh, well, you know, I watch food dyes. We don't really watch a lot of food dyes. Well, let me just give you a list of foods that have food dyes in them, okay? Like red dye number 40 in particular. So Kraft barbecue sauce, Hamburger Helper, nacho cheese Doritos, Duncan Hines home-style vanilla frosting. Okay, so you don't see the red, but it's in that vanilla frosting. Like Welch's frozen fruit bars. Fruit snacks kill me. Fruit snacks are nothing but food dyes and corn syrup and just junk. But like Schweppes ginger ale, Lipton iced tea, a lot of children's vitamins have food dyes in them, and Tylenol. Okay, and an interesting little side note on Tylenol, just from my own experiences. So my son, my children are high fever spikers, which really just means that their immune system recognizes that there's a threat and they're trying to mount a proper response and deal with this virus or bacteria. But one time my son had a really high fever and we were out of town at a friend's house and we gave him some Tylenol and not even thinking about it. This was Tylenol with red dye added to it. I mean, why we need to add red dye to Tylenol, I don't understand. Yeah. But about 2 hours later, he was completely hallucinating. He didn't know who I was. He was very fearful. He was running about 103 temperature. And at first I just linked it to the fever. Like, that's weird. You know, come on, buddy, it's your mama, because he literally didn't know who I was. And then eventually, that faded, but it was very unsettling. And then they sent the Tylenol home with me. It ended up in my cupboard. About 6 months later, we're sick again with another high fever. That's the only Tylenol I have in my cupboard, not thinking. I give it to him. And we had the same hallucination effect. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh. So his brain is already lit up from the fever. We're already on fire, literally from the fever. And now I'm just dumping a neurotoxin into his system again. And it's literally causing him to not know who I am. Which was just such an eye-opening experience for me because of the fact that we don't have a lot of food dyes in our house, or not at all. What a simple exposure of that did to my son's brain. So when you look at just these poor kids' brains with hyperactivity or inability to focus, or they're trying hard to behave and all of a sudden they're just explosive, how much of that can be traced back to food dyes or preservatives or high sugar content in the foods that we're giving them? Yeah.
I had a similar experience when I first got on to what might be going on. I talked with a good friend of mine, Katie Brown, and I was like, the kids are just really misbehaving this summer. I can't figure out what's going on. And she said, well, what are they diet or, what are you feeding them? And I am like Midwest woman. We bake bread. We still do casseroles and that kind of thing. But fairly, we don't have a lot of candy in the house. But I was giving them Freezy Pops as early as 8 in the morning. Because I'm like, well, who cares? It's like 10 calories. It's just sugar and water, and they're outside. They'll burn it off anyways, not realizing the dye situation. So she said, oh, Becca, they've got dyes in them. And I said, well, they don't have any allergies to dyes. And she said, no, it's like a behavioral allergy. Right. She said, take them away and see what happens. And it was night and day. They were no longer hitting each other and biting, because I couldn't figure out, like, why are you biting? It's like 8:30. You don't even have enough to be mad about. And that was my aha moment. So I started looking for it in everything. And I wish Tylenol, I don't know if I think they do now.
You can find it in dye-free.
But then why don't they offer that across the board?
Right.
Like,
why don't they just eliminate it? Yeah.
Why are we?
The thing about that is in 2011, okay, so we've known since the 1970s, studies started to come out saying, yeah, there is a link between erratic behavior or concerning psychiatric behavior and food dyes, yet it's still in our food supply. In 2011, the FDA finally acknowledges that, yes, red dye is a problem and links it to erratic behavior, but they don't get rid of it. You can't find food dye in England or Australia in their food supply. But in the United States, our food industry dumps 15 million pounds of artificial dyes into our food supply every year. And 40% of that is red dye number 40. So
and other countries have that figured out. So, like, they don't have Twizzlers or, they don't use food dye at all?
England and Australia has banned red dye number 40. So maybe they don't have Twizzlers, or they have found a more natural way of coloring Twizzlers red, which you can. Like, I buy fruit snacks for my kids, and they're red, but they sure aren't with food dyes. They're just beet juice is a great way of, coloring something red. And then the other thing is they don't always label it as red dye number 40. So you have all of these different names that you're trying to label it as,
because that's the only thing I look for.
Right, exactly. Like, you're trying to be diligent, and they're sneaking it in other ways. So other words to look for that means red dye is Allura Red AC. So ALLURA, red AC. And then sometimes they just give you like letters and numbers combinations. So it'll just say FDNC number 40, CI16035. That basically is just red dye, or CI Food Red 17. Isn't that crazy? Like, if you didn't know what to look for, you're trying to avoid red dyes. And if you unfortunately have a child whose brain is very vulnerable to toxicity from red dye, you might not even know that they're still getting it in certain supplies or certain foods.
So, Dr. Mullen, can you tell me, though, my children are not diagnosed with ADHD, but there is a marked difference in each one of mine, and a different difference when, Gus has red dye, or blue dye for that matter. He becomes really emotional, and he'll just cry on the drop of a hat, and he's 11. Iverson turns really naughty in the mouth, really, really naughty in the mouth. And so, like, hers is mood, and then my other two are, like, biting and scratching and stuff. So does it matter if the child is vulnerable to these things at all, or is it like children across the board will experience these symptoms with red dye?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a medical psychologist out in California. He's written numerous books, Dr. Daniel Amen. And his whole point is, I'm the only kind of doctor as a psychologist that, the psychology field in general is the only field that doesn't look at the organ they're treating. Right, so we run heart scans and we run ultrasounds of your GI system and your gallbladder, but psychologists or psychiatrists don't look at the actual brain before they write out a prescription for something, or before they treat something or make a diagnosis of something. So he started doing SPECT scans on people's brains, and he's done all of this interesting information, or all of these interesting testing that looks at what a SPECT scan does of the brain. So basically, a SPECT scan looks at different areas of the brain and how they light up. And in certain people, certain areas of the brain are more lit up, and that might be part of their hyperactivity or moods or violent tendencies or whatever that might be. So he did this whole study on these children who were exhibiting erratic behavior, right? And so he did a SPECT scan of their brain after they took red dye. and their brain looked like it had exploded. Like there was so much activity lit up on the screen.
Oh.
And then a few days later, after the red dye had cleared from the system, he ran another SPECT scan on these exact same kids, and the brain looked perfectly normal. So you're exactly right, Rebekah. Like, it just depends upon, you don't have to have hyperactivity for your brain to feel the effects of a food dye or a toxin or whatever that might be. And unfortunately, a lot of these foods that have food dyes in them are also very high in sugar or corn syrup. And so you just gave your body food dyes, and you just gave your body a huge amount of sugar, and now your insulin system is having to kick off, and then your stress systems get activated. I mean, you can physiologically trace the whole hormonal connection between eating a freeze pop in the morning and what's actually happening there, in their brain. And not just from a food dye perspective, but just from a general reaction to what you are eating. With every bite of food, you have a whole biochemical reaction that occurs inside the body. And especially kids, because they just haven't developed the self-awareness yet. It's that much harder on them when they do get exposed to foods like this, because they don't link it back to the fact that they had fruit snacks a little bit ago or something like that.
Unless you start educating them on it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because they don't know it until I started making them self-aware. When we first started it, of course, it was really hard because you didn't want to be that mom. You didn't want them to show up to the birthday party and say you can't have a cupcake with pink frosting. But I would say, okay, you're going to eat that, but I want you to be really aware of how you're acting right now. And in 30 minutes, what your behavior will be. And if this is the case, we're going to leave the birthday party or whatever it is. And so now, and that was as young as 5, they do realize, and I can tell them within it's like 15, 20 minutes. I'm like, what is going on? Why are you acting this way? And they'll say, Mom, I had a Tootsie Pop at the bank. Whatever it might be. So they're aware that this causes problems, or I'll say, you better drink a ton of water because they need to flush it out of their system.
Absolutely. And what a great life skill to be able to teach your kids. I have the same conversations with my children constantly. And I have a 12-year-old, and she is highly motivated. She's a good little athlete. She's a good student. And she's come to directly realize, the correlation between what she eats and how she performs. So, I mean, her breakfast in the morning is typically half an avocado, an egg, and 1 slice of bacon. She's getting her protein, she's getting her fats, and she's limiting her carbohydrates. And she's 12. But she's also just recognizing how much better she feels. And even my 10 and 5-year-old boys are getting on board with this. They are understanding that I want to feel good today, so I'm going to make good choices. Do they always? No. But they're aware of the fact that this is how they feel when they don't. And, hopefully as life goes on and they're exposed to more dangerous things, I mean, let's be honest, right? Hopefully they can have that developed self-awareness that really helps them grow and develop into making wiser choices as teenagers and adults.
Yeah. And I think to help aid that, especially in our children, is to make the choices for yourself as well. I related it back to them when they're like, well, it's no fair. Adults can have red dye. And I said, nope, if you guys can't, I won't. And then I gave them the analogy of why I gave up Diet Coke. It made me so irritable. It totally wasn't worth it. And I have blood sugar problems already. So I would consume 1,000 calories within drinking it because I was just so hungry or whatever. I just had all these shakes. So that I could relate to them, and they would go, okay, well, if Mom's making good choices, then I'm going to make good choices. Do you think that artificial flavorings have the same effect, or imitation flavorings?
Absolutely. And really, sometimes it's just not even the actual dye, but the chemicals that come along with the dye, or preservatives like MSG. MSG really messes with brains, and so you just have to do the best you can to try to eat real food, right? And so if you can't pronounce half the ingredients on the box of whatever food you're buying, it's probably full of potential brain toxins or chemicals or preservatives that your body is not going to know what to do with. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't know how to cook. Well, try, learn a new skill. And the other thing that drives me crazy is when people say, well, I don't have time. It is a choice. It is a choice to decide if you're going to take the time to go to the grocery store and buy healthy food. I mean, I work full time and I've got 3 kids, and I still make it a choice. I don't always get my house clean, but for me, my children having healthy meals is more important. And the other thing is kind of taking back onto what you were saying before about the example we set as parents, is one of the things that I think is so tragic is when I will have like a mom and her son, in my treatment room, and we're talking about, why this child's constipated and has hyperactivity, and we're trying to make some food choices, and I make the suggestion of, well, let's try to eat more vegetables, right? And the mom will say, and she doesn't understand how this is coming off, but the mom will say, oh, he hates vegetables. We're not going to eat vegetables. And she's already telling him and reaffirming in his young brain, yep, you hate vegetables, so don't eat them, rather than saying, you know what? Great. We're going to try one vegetable this week. We're just going to try to introduce cucumbers and try to eat more cucumbers, But when you come off already shooting down the idea of eating healthy or, then your children hear that. Do you understand what I'm saying? But if you embrace it as like a fun adventure to go on for your family, then they get on board.
Yeah. And I think going to that whole life living too is, even if you can't go full bore into it, you're not going to learn how to cook. Just like you said, try one vegetable a week or try to cook one thing a week.
Exactly.
Our podcast is The Encourager, so we're encouraging you. We're not shaming you into anything, but really exploring the fact that your diet has so much to do with the behavior and the whole atmosphere of your home. If you can be in more control of for sure, of behavior. I'm telling you, it will make such a big difference in how you even make decisions for your life and for your business and for your husband when everybody is less stressed because of what we're putting into our body.
Absolutely. And it is overwhelming, right? Like, it's hard. When you yourself aren't feeling great or you're exhausted. I mean, I get that. I've been there. I understand, like, just the thought of cooking a meal from scratch just sounds like the most exhausting thing in the world. But if you just say, I'm going to do the best I can, and this meal, the only thing I'm going to try to do is push a few vegetables and not have food dyes. Like, that's a great step in the right direction. And just taking it a little bit at a time, but also coming at it from a place of creativity and curiosity so that you're like, maybe this is going to be my project for the month. Like, I'm going to try a couple new recipes. Some of them might taste amazing. Some of them may taste awful. Don't get frustrated if your kids don't want to eat that. You tried. And, try something else next week. And the other thing I have found when I'm trying to introduce something new and healthy is I do not overwhelm the amount that I put on their plate. So I usually just put a small amount, a very small amount. If it's something new or has kind of a different texture or a different flavor or maybe isn't as sweet as they're used to, I say, you just have to eat this one bite of it. But I make them eat one bite of that all week long so that by the end of the week, their taste buds have kind of adapted to that and they've gotten used to what that tastes like. So that next week when we try something new, it's not a shock to the system. And that child's maybe more open to trying something new. But if you dump a whole pile full on their plate and say, you're going to eat this, then they're going to buy, right?
Yeah. I totally agree. We have the 10-time rule, 10X rule. You got to try it 10 times before you can tell me you don't like it. So the first time you
that's a great idea.
Okay, I tried it. And then the rest of the week we keep trying it. It's how I got them to like hummus. Because the first time they're like, no. And I may have lied a little bit and said there was sour cream in it to get my 5-year-old to eat it, but she did end up liking it.
Right. My kids are very suspicious. They're like, all right, Mom, what'd you sneak into this one?
Yeah. And so now
I'm like, eat it.
There isn't any sour cream in this one. But, they will adjust.
Hello, encouragers. If you are feeling encouraged during this podcast or need more clarification or direction, I do offer coaching. And then also we offer a 1-day workshop. Visit our website at shopresd.com and click on the podcast link on the top bar. I would love to chat with you and help you succeed.
You have written here, and we talked about it a little bit in our pre-interview, Dr. Melanie, what about blood sugar issues in our young children? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so obviously childhood obesity is on the rise. Early onset type 2 diabetes is definitely on the rise. Even late teenagers have been diagnosed with it, people in their early 20s. And usually that starts to show up fairly early in life, especially when a child's diet is mostly sugar and carbohydrates. The tricky thing about it is when when your child is allowed to eat just mostly sugar and carbohydrates, or that's what their body gets used to eating, and that's what they think they need to eat. But the interesting thing about blood sugar is every time you eat something high in sugar, you have to produce insulin because your body knows that sugar in the blood is dangerous. I have to get it out of here and do something with it. So we secrete insulin to deal with it. And so we either use that sugar for energy right away, or it gets stored as fat in the form of triglycerides. And so over time, when we're constantly eating sugar, then we're over-secreting insulin, and then the insulin starts to not be heard as well. And that's what's called insulin resistance. So I always say insulin is like that annoying voice in the background that after a while you just don't hear anymore, because it's being so overproduced all the time that it's becoming less and less effective. So you're having to secrete more and more of it. In the meantime, you're developing higher triglycerides, you're having more stored fat, your mood swings go with the sugar. So, I mean, kind of like you described earlier, after you would have something sweet, then your system would crash out. For my daughter, I can see it instantly when she's had too much sugar because her mood just tanks with it. If we keep a lot of the sugary foods away from her, she's the most pleasant, stable child ever, but you can see her mood crash if she's had, like a breakfast with too many carbohydrates. And also, like, think about it. So if we just give their brains sugar in the morning, like sugar cereal or a bagel with jelly or toaster strudel, something like that, and then we send them off to school and want them to be able to function, sit still for 8 hours and focus, I don't know if I could do that. I'd be looking for a cup of coffee by 10 o'clock or, just a little pick-me-up for when my system's crashing out on me and looking for the next source of sugar. And so it becomes this little bit of roller coaster ride all day long in terms of sugar burning, sugar consumption, getting rid of sugar out of the bloodstream that really affects their overall pancreas function, blood sugar function, and sets them down the road towards developing early onset diabetes issues.
Can you tell me what is the danger of triglycerides?
So triglycerides are, as adults, we know triglycerides are checked when they check your lipid level. So your cholesterol, your good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, and triglycerides. Triglycerides are directly linked to the sugar you eat. When you eat more sugar than your body can burn at one time, we convert that sugar into fat, and triglycerides is stored fat from sugar consumption.
Good to know.
Yeah, so sometimes I'll have somebody come in who's super skinny, right?
Yes.
That doesn't mean they're healthy. Like, I say this all the time. But they're concerned because their triglycerides are through the roof. And I'll say, well, what's your sugar consumption like? And they'll kind of get the sheepish grin on their face. And, they know, right? They're like, I really like my sugar, and I get that. But the other interesting thing about sugar is it targets the same area in our brain that cocaine does. So you get that same dopamine hit when you have sugar than somebody who's a cocaine addict does. It's the same area of the brain. So it stimulates our reward system. So you send out this feeling of, I like that. I want more. So rather than one Oreo, I'm going to have 5 Oreos because my brain wants me to continue to feed that loop. It's fascinating.
Yeah, because when about 10 years ago, it's been about 15 years ago, went to have our life insurance, got married. We're like, we're going to get life insurance. And I was above what was normal for triglycerides. And I was like, well, what is this about? So then they explained it to me, and they said, well, what did you eat before I took this test? I'm like, a granola bar. And they're like, oh, well, that would explain some of this test. And then I had to retest for it, and I ended up being in the normal-ish range. But I've always wondered since, I'm like, I should probably have it redone and find out what's going on.
Right.
How am I doing
triglycerides shouldn't be dependent upon what you eat that day. They should be more what you've eaten over time. But, you never know. Blood tests are blood tests. But your blood sugar level will absolutely be affected by what you eat that day, like your fasting blood glucose when they check that. But your hemoglobin A1C is looking at what your blood sugar level is doing over time. So, if you have concerns for your child or even for yourself about what your blood sugar is doing, I often recommend having both of those tests done, a fasting blood glucose test, which is looking at what your blood sugar is doing today, versus a hemoglobin A1C test, which is looking at what your blood sugar is doing over time.
Okay. Okay. Oh, yes, both do tests. Okay. We will, and don't worry, encouragers, we're going to write this in all of our podcast notes in the show notes so you can still travel in the car right now while you're listening and still stay tuned. Tell us a little bit about how do you incorporate healthy snacks and healthy meals into a child's day? So, I'm thinking like things that they can just grab and go play, or, what do we underestimate? I've been really trying this last year to do after-school snack that doesn't have sugar in it, and I'm not probably to the degree I should be, but I've been really limiting things. Can you give us some more ideas for healthy snacks?
Absolutely. Well, and I'll first say that should is a very dangerous word. We can should ourselves all day long, right?
True story. True story.
But so healthy snacks, right? So I'm a big good fats person because you need fat for lasting fuel, and fat is not going to make you fat unless it's bad fat, like French fries or deep fat fried foods or that type of thing. But fat from peanut butter or almond butter or avocado or, that type of thing is going to be a great source of good fat. So I try to have a good balance for my children of all of those, of the 3 macronutrient food groups. So carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So when my kids come home from school, like half an apple with peanut butter on top is a great way. They get protein, fat, and a little bit of carbohydrate from the apple, plus the fiber. String cheese is a good option unless your child suffers from constipation or a dairy sensitivity. I do a lot of veggies. Like I'll often have a tray full of sliced veggies that they can just grab. So, just carrots and cucumbers and just stuff like that they'll have a couple. I dabble a lot with healthy baking. So this is where you get creative, but like I have a recipe for brownies that are actually the flour base is ground up raw walnuts. And I grind them up in my food processor until they're in a flour form. And then I add a little bit of dark cocoa and maple syrup and eggs and that type of thing. But it creates delicious brownies. And they get such good fat from the walnuts and protein from the walnuts without the inflammatory component of the flour and sugar. So there's a lot of great recipe books out there. There's a lot of great options. And for me, I like to bake, and I need to bake because it's very nurturing for me. But there's ways you can bake without needing to add a whole bunch of junk to that. It just takes, like I said earlier, a little bit of creativity and curiosity and exploring different recipes.
Yes, I love to bake, just like the regimen of it, and it clears my head, and it's almost like therapy. But I have not done the walnut flour, and it'll be a long stretch for me to do that. But I'm going to try it, Dr. Melanie.
I think you're going to be amazed. Or even like almond flour, there are a ton of recipes out there. I mean, just like the other day, I was reading Real Simple, and then I think Martha Stewart in those magazines, they had recipes for cakes made with almond flour. Like such a great source of protein and fat for your child or for yourself, and it tastes delicious. Like I make pancakes out of almond flour and coconut flour, and my kids can't tell. Like they have no idea. And I sneak in some coconut oil and just, a variety of different things, and I've experimented with it.
Now that you just said coconut oil, we use exclusively coconut oil. We no longer use vegetable oil or canola oil or any of that. We just use coconut oil, and then I use olive oil when I'm cooking. But then I read something about, it was some documentary where they're talking about coconut oil being used in popcorn in the movie theaters. Does coconut oil have, what's the word? It starts with a T. Trans fats in it?
Trans fats. No, it does not. Coconut oil is a medium chain triglyceride. It's probably one of the best fats for you that you can eat. Okay. Good. But if it's heated over super high heat, it can oxidize, which can cause some damage. Such as the same with almost any oil. And just as a general rule, like, when I'm in a hurry, my tendency is to throw the oil in the pan and add my meat and veggies and crank it on high and cook it as fast as I can, right? Well, you're really oxidizing your meat, which means creating inflammation. You're oxidizing your oil, which means you're creating inflammation. So if you can cook it just slower and on a lower heat, you have much less risk of any sort of damage. But there should not be trans fats in your coconut oil unless you have some random brand where they're trying to sneak something like that in. But trans fats are really bad. They're awful for you. But just quick along those same lines, like olive oil, the olive oil industry is under a lot of heat right now because there's not a lot of regulation. And so you think you're buying a bottle of pure olive oil, and they've done studies where like half of the bottle has just been cheap soybean oil or canola oil that's been added to it. Right. And so that's really frustrating. So, and a lot of, like, how many people have gone to the oil section of the grocery store and they have all of these different choices for oils or olive oil? You've got cold pressed, first pressed, expeller pressed. Like, what does all of that mean, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I always tell people to look for an organic olive oil and to look for first extra virgin cold pressed. Or cold pressed or first pressed. It means that the very first time they squeeze the olives, the oil that comes out of there is extracted and put into your jar. If it doesn't say that, you're just getting byproducts.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am going to listen to this one. I always listen to them several times to get this, but just again, encouragers, the whole point of this was it's something that I'm practicing in my own family with limiting dyes, artificial flavorings, really trying hard to not have as much sugar, just so that I can be more in control of their behaviors and just for the better health of their whole life, that they will learn to just naturally grab the vegetable or the fruit before they go to the baked goods at the college lineup.
Absolutely.
We're really hoping that they can make the correlation between what we put into our body and what comes out, and especially what God calls us to do in taking care of our bodies. So I think it's really important that, this isn't a shaming podcast at all, but just an awareness of what you can start doing to aid your family best. Do you have any closing thoughts, Dr. Melanie, to tell our encouragers?
Just along those same lines, like, don't be hard on yourself. Like, we're all doing the best we can to get through the day, and some days are easier than others in terms of choices we make for ourselves and choices we make for our kids. But if you just come at it from a mindset of, I'm going to do the best I can, and even if you cut down on their sugars by 50%, that's awesome. That's a 50% improvement, right? You can't come at it from a perfectionistic tendency where if I can't be perfect at doing this, I'm not going to do it at all, because that's not going to work. I have days where I make bad choices all the time, right? But at the end of the day, I'm doing the best I can, and tomorrow's a new day, and you go from there.
Yes. Dr. Melanie, how can we follow up with you? Do you do blog posts or anything with your chiropractic center?
I don't. We're like so archaic technology-wise, but we are working on getting a website, so we are getting there. And but I do like nutrition consults with people. We're in the process of developing a website with some blogs and that type of thing. So I am entering this century technology-wise, I promise. But
good, because you would be excellent. I'd read every one of them. This would be excellent.
Well, thank you.
I will encourage you.
And I love to write. So I'm definitely thinking of going down that road more often. I have started to do presentations in town, where people can come and learn for an hour to 2 hours of different topics that I've been talking about, because I just think there's such a need for education out there. There's so much information, and people don't know where to begin and what to read and what's accurate and what's not, and it's totally overwhelming. And I love to sift through the data and figure out what's true and what's not, and so I've been doing more and more of that type of thing. So, we have a Facebook page, so if we're going to have a current presentation or anything up and about doing that, you can check out the Chiropractic Center for Healthy Living, and we list all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Melanie. We appreciate your time, and encouragers, we got this.
Hey, encouragers! If you're feeling overwhelmed, if you've had the scene where you're crying because there's no way you can meet all the roles in your life, I've been there. I've so been there, but I'm not there anymore. And I know how you can get out of that slump and start executing on all the things that God has equipped you to do. You can pick up my book at equippedtoexecute.com, also on my website at shoparsd.com, and it's also available on Amazon. Thank you for tuning in, encouragers. Remember to subscribe so it's automatically on your phone, and please rate and review me. We got this, encouragers.